Foot binding was the custom of applying painfully tight binding to the feet of young girls to prevent further growth. The practice possibly originated among upper-class court dancers during the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period in Imperial China, then became popular during the Song dynasty and eventually spread to all social classes. Foot binding became popular as a means of displaying status and was correspondingly adopted as a symbol of beauty in Chinese culture. Its prevalence and practice, however, varied in different parts of the country. Feet altered by binding were called lotus feet. The Manchu Kangxi Emperor tried to ban foot binding in 1664 but failed. In the later part of the 19th century, Chinese reformers challenged the practice, but it was not until the early 20th century that foot binding began to die out as a result of anti-foot binding campaigns. Foot binding resulted in lifelong disabilities for most of its subjects, and a few elderly Chinese women still survive today with disabilities related to the bound feet. History. Origins. There are many suggestions for the origin of foot binding. One story relates that during the Shang dynasty, the concubine Daji, who was said to have club foot, asked the emperor to make foot binding mandatory for all girls in court so that her own feet would be the standard of beauty and elegance. Another story tells of a favorite courtesan of Emperor Xiaobaojuan, Pan Yue, who had delicate feet, dancing barefoot over a floor decorated with golden lotus flower design. The emperor expressed admiration and said that lotus springs from her every step, a reference to the Buddhist legend of Padmavati under whose feet lotus springs forth. This story may have given rise to the terms golden lotus or lotus feet used to describe bound feet. There is, however, no evidence that Pan Yue ever bound her feet. The general consensus is that the practice is likely to have originated from the time of Emperor Li Yu. Emperor Li Yu created a 6-foot-tall golden lotus decorated with precious stones and pearls, and asked his concubine Laoniang to bind her feet in white silk into the shape of the crescent moon, and performed a dance ballet-like on the points of her feet on the lotus. Laoniang's dance was said to be so graceful that others sought to imitate her. The binding of feet was then replicated by other upper-class women and the practice spread. The practice of foot binding became popular during the Song dynasty, and the earliest known references to bound feet appeared in the late 11th century. In the 12th century, in the earliest extant discourse on the practice of foot binding, Zhang Bangji considered that a bound foot should be arch-shaped and small. A 13th century writer, Che Ruo Shui, complained that little children not yet 4 or 5 years old, who have done nothing wrong, nevertheless are made to suffer unlimited pain to bind small. I do not know what use this is. Evidence from archaeology indicates that foot binding was practiced among the wives and daughters of officials in the 13th century. However, the style of bound feet found in Song dynasty tombs, where the big toe was bent upwards, appears to be different from the norm of subsequent eras, and the excessive smallness of the feet, the 3-inch golden lotus, may be a later development in the 16th century. The practice became increasingly common in the following centuries among the gentry families, later spreading to the general population. By the end of the Song dynasty, men would drink from a special shoe whose heel contained a small cup. During the Yuan dynasty, some would also drink directly from the shoe itself. This louche practice was called toast to the golden lotus and lasted until the late Qing dynasty. The Manchus issued a number of edicts to ban the practice. First in 1636, when the Manchu leader Hong Taiji declared the founding of the new Qing dynasty, then in 1638, and another in 1664 by the Kangxi Emperor. However, few Han Chinese complied with the edicts and Kangxi eventually abandoned the effort in 1668. By the 19th century, it was estimated that 40 to 50% of Chinese women had bound feet, and among upper-class Han Chinese women, the figure was almost 100%. Bound feet became a mark of beauty and was also a prerequisite for finding a husband. It also became an avenue for poorer women to marry into money. For example, in Guangdong in the late 19th century, it was customary to bind the feet of the eldest daughter of a lower-class family who was intended to be brought up as a lady. Her younger sisters would grow up to be bond servants or domestic slaves and be able to work in the fields, but the eldest daughter would assume to never have the need to work. Women, the families, and the husbands took great pride in tiny feet, with the ideal length called the golden lotus, being about 3 Chinese inches long in Western measurement. This pride was reflected in the elegantly embroidered silk slippers and wrappings girls and women wore to cover the feet. Walking on bound feet necessitated bending the knees slightly and swaying to maintain proper movement and balance, a dainty walk that was also considered erotic to some men. Many women with bound feet were in fact able to walk and work in the fields, albeit with greater limitation than the non-bound counterparts. In the 19th and early 20th century, dances with bound feet were very popular, as were circus performers who stood on prancing or running horses. Women with bound feet in one village in Yunnan province even formed a regional dance troupe to perform for tourists in the late 20th century, though age has since forced the group to retire. In other areas, women in the 70s and 80s could be found providing limited assistance to the workers in the rice fields well into the 21st century. Variation in practice. Foot binding was practiced in various forms and its prevalence varied in different regions. In Sichuan, a less severe form, called cucumber foot, due to its slender shape, folded the 4 toes under but did not force up the heel and taper the ankle. Some working women in Jiangsu made a pretense of binding while keeping their feet natural. Not all women were always bound. Some women once bound remained bound all through their lives, but some were only briefly bound, and some were bound only until the marriage. Foot binding was most common among women whose work involved domestic crafts and those in urban areas. It was also more common in northern China, where it was widely practiced by women of all social classes, but less so in parts of southern China such as Guangdong and Guangxi, where it was largely a practice of women in the provincial capitals or among the gentry. Manchu women, as well as Mongol and Chinese women in the 8 banners, did not bind the feet, and the most a Manchu woman might do was to wrap the feet tightly to give them a slender appearance. The Manchus, wanting to emulate the particular gait that bound feet necessitated, invented their own type of shoe that caused them to walk in a similar swaying manner. These flower bowl or horse hoof shoes have a platform generally made of wood 2 to 6 inches in height and fitted to the middle of the sole, or they have a small central tapered pedestal. Many Han Chinese in the inner city of Beijing also did not bind the feet, and it was reported in the mid-1800s that around 50 to 60% of non-banner women had unbound feet. Bound feet nevertheless became a significant differentiating marker between Han women and Manchu or other banner women. The Hakka people, however, were unusual among Han Chinese in not practicing foot binding at all. Most non-Han Chinese people, such as the Manchus, Mongols and Tibetans, did not bind their feet. However, some non-Han ethnic groups did. Foot binding was practiced by the Hui Muslims in Gansu province, the Dungan Muslims, descendants of Hui from northwestern China who fled to Central Asia, were also seen practicing foot binding up to 1948. In southern China, in Guangzhou, West China, James Legge encountered a mosque which had a placard denouncing foot binding, saying Islam did not allow it since it constituted violating the creation of God. demise. Opposition to foot binding had been raised by some Chinese writers in the 18th century. In the mid-19th century, many of the rebel leaders of the Taiping Rebellion were of Hakka background, where the women did not bind the feet, and foot binding was outlawed. The rebellion, however, failed, and Christian missionaries, who had provided education for girls and actively discouraged what they considered a barbaric practice, then played a part in changing elite opinion on foot binding through education, pamphleteering, and lobbying of the King Court. In 1875, 60 to 70 Christian women in Xiamen attended a meeting presided over by a missionary John McGowan and formed the Natural Foot Society. It was then championed by the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, founded in 1883 and advocated by missionaries including Timothy Richard, who thought that Christianity could promote equality between the sexes. Reform-minded Chinese intellectuals began to consider foot binding to be an aspect of the culture that needed to be eliminated. In the 1883, Kang Youwei founded the Anti-Foot Binding Society near Canton to combat the practice, and anti-foot binding societies sprang up across the country, with membership for the movement claimed to reach 300,000. The anti-foot binding movement, however, stressed pragmatic and patriotic reasons rather than feminist ones. That abolition of foot binding would lead to better health and more efficient labor. Reformers such as Liang Qichao, influenced by social Darwinism, also argued that it weakened the nation, since enfeebled women supposedly produced weak sons. At the turn of the 20th century, early feminists, such as Qi Yujin, called for the end of foot binding. In 1902, the Empress Dowager Cixi issued an anti-foot binding edict, but it was soon rescinded. In 1912, the new Republic of China government banned foot binding, and leading intellectuals of the May 4th movement saw foot binding as a major symbol of China's backwardness. Local warlords such as Yan Zishan in Shanxi engaged in their own sustained campaign against foot binding, with feet inspectors and fines for those who continued with the practice, and regional governments of the later Nanjing regime also enforced the ban. The campaign against foot binding was very successful in some regions. In one province, a 1929 survey showed that while only 2.3% of girls born before 1910 had unbound feet, 95% of those born after were not bound. In a region south of Beijing, Dingshan, where over 99% of women were once bound, no new cases were found among those born after 1919. In Taiwan, the practice was also discouraged by the ruling Japanese from the beginning of Japanese rule, and from 1911 to 1915 it was gradually made illegal. The practice, however, lingered on in some regions in China. In 1928, a census in rural Shanxi found that 18% of women had bound feet, while in some remote rural areas such as Yunnan province it continued to be practiced until the 1950s. In most parts of China, however, the practice had virtually disappeared by 1949. The practice was also stigmatized in Communist China, and the last vestiges of foot binding was stamped out, with the last new case of foot binding reported in 1957. By the 21st century, only a few elderly women in China still have bound feet. In 1999, the last shoe factory making lotus shoes, the Zhiqiang Shoe Factory in Harbin, closed. The process was started before the arch of the foot had a chance to develop fully, usually between the ages of 4 and 9. Binding usually started during the winter months since the feet were more likely to be numb, and therefore the pain would not be as extreme. First, each foot would be soaked in a warm mixture of herbs and animal blood. This was intended to soften the foot and aid the binding. Then, the toenails were cut back as far as possible to prevent ingrowth and subsequent infections. Since the toes were to be pressed tightly into the sole of the foot, cotton bandages, 3 meters long and 5 centimeters wide, were prepared by soaking them in the blood and herb mixture. To enable the size of the feet to be reduced, the toes on each foot were curled under, then pressed with great force downwards and squeezed into the sole of the foot until the toes broke. The broken toes were held tightly against the sole of the foot while the foot was then drawn down straight with the leg and the arch of the foot was forcibly broken. The bandages were repeatedly wound in a figure-8 movement, starting at the inside of the foot at the instep, then carried over the toes, under the foot, and around the heel, the freshly broken toes being pressed tightly into the sole of the foot. At each pass around the foot, the binding cloth was tightened, pulling the ball of the foot and the heel together, causing the broken foot to fold at the arch, and pressing the toes underneath the sole. The binding was pulled so tightly that the girl could not move her toes at all, and the ends of the binding cloth were then sewn so that the girl could not loosen it. The girl's broken feet required a great deal of care and attention, and they would be unbound regularly. Each time the feet were unbound, they were washed, the toes carefully checked for injury, and the nails carefully and meticulously trimmed. When unbound, the broken feet were also needed to soften them, and the soles of the girl's feet were often beaten to make the joints and broken bones more flexible. The feet were also soaked in a concoction that caused any necrotic flesh to fall off. Immediately after this agonizing pedicure, the girl's broken toes were folded back under and the feet were rebound. The bindings were pulled even tighter each time the girl's feet were rebound. This unbinding and rebinding ritual was repeated as often as possible with fresh bindings. The process caused the girl devastating foot pain, but this was seen as a positive as it made the girl more compliant. It was generally an elder female member of the girl's family or a professional foot binder who carried out the initial breaking and ongoing binding of the feet. It was considered preferable to have someone other than the mother do it, as she might have been sympathetic to her daughter's pain and less willing to keep the bindings tight. For most, the bound feet eventually became numb. However, once a foot had been crushed and bound, attempting to reverse the process by unbinding is painful, and the shape could not be reversed without a woman undergoing the same pain all over again. Health issues. The most common problem with bound feet was infection. Despite the amount of care taken in regularly trimming the toenails, they would often ingrow, becoming infected and causing injuries to the toes. Sometimes for this reason the girl's toenails would be peeled back and removed altogether. The tightness of the binding meant that the circulation in the feet was faulty, and the circulation to the toes was almost cut off. So any injuries to the toes were unlikely to heal and were likely to gradually worsen and lead to infected toes and rotting flesh. If the infection in the feet and toes entered the bones, it could cause them to soften, which could result in toes dropping off. Although this was seen as a benefit because the feet could then be bound even more tightly. Girls whose toes were more fleshy would sometimes have shards of glass or pieces of broken tiles inserted within the binding next to her feet and between her toes to cause injury and introduce infection deliberately. Disease inevitably followed infection, meaning that death from septic shock could result from foot binding, and a surviving girl was more at risk for medical problems as she grew older. It is thought that as many as 10% of girls may die from gangrene and other infections due to foot binding. At the beginning of the binding, many of the foot bones would remain broken, often for years. However, as the girl grew older, the bones would begin to heal. Even after the foot bones had healed, they were prone to re-breaking repeatedly, especially when the girl was in her teenage years and her feet were still soft. Bones in the girl's feet would often be deliberately broken again in order to improve the size of the shape of the feet. This was especially the case with the toes. As small toes were especially desirable, the girl would often suffer the pain and indignity of having her toes broken multiple times. Older women were more likely to break hips and other bones in falls, since they could not balance securely on the feet, and were less able to rise to the feet from a sitting position. Other issues that might arise from foot binding included paralysis and muscular atrophy. Appeal and interpretations. Bound feet were considered an enhancement to a woman's beauty and made her movement more dainty, and a woman with perfect lotus feet was likely to make a more prestigious marriage. It was also considered intensely erotic by some, and Qing Dynasty sex manuals listed 48 different ways of playing with women's bound feet. Some men preferred never to see a woman's bound feet, so they were always concealed within tiny lotus shoes and wrappings. Fengzun is recorded as stating, "If you remove the shoes and bindings, the aesthetic feeling will be destroyed forever," an indication that men understood that the symbolic erotic fantasy of bound feet did not correspond to its unpleasant physical reality, which was therefore to be kept hidden. The fact that the bound foot was concealed from men's eyes was considered to be sexually appealing. On the other hand, an uncovered foot would also give off a foul odor, as various saprobic microorganisms would colonize the unwashable folds. For men, the primary erotic effect was a function of the lotus gait, the tiny steps and swaying walk of a woman whose feet had been bound. Women with such deformed feet avoided placing weight on the front of the foot and tended to walk predominantly on the heels. As a result, women who underwent foot binding walked in a careful, cautious, and unsteady manner. It has been argued that a woman with bound feet, due to her limited mobility, limited her ability to take part in politics, social life and the world. Bound feet rendered women dependent on the families, particularly the men, since a woman was largely restricted to her home and could not venture far without an escort or the help of watchful servants. However, some scholars reject the theories that bound feet in China were considered more beautiful, or that it was a means of male control over women, a sign of class status, or a chance for women to marry well. They also argued that foot binding was important in work, and can be seen as a way by mothers to tie the daughters down, train them in handwork and keep them close at hand. It has also been argued that while the practice started out as a fashion, it persisted because it became an expression of Han identity after the Mongols invaded China in 1279, as it was then practiced only by Han women. During the Qing dynasty, attempts were made by the Manchus to ban the practice but failed, and it has been argued the attempts at banning may have in fact led to a spread of the practice among Han Chinese in the 17th and 18th centuries.